Derek, give thanks for being here. I wonder if we'll begin with a poem of yours.
The epigraph is from Bob Marley, which I will now sing. I will not sing because you laughed. Kaya now, got to have Kaya now, got to have Kaya now, for the rain is falling. Marley was rocking on the transport stereo, and the beauty was humming the choruses quietly. I could see where the lights on the planes of her cheek streaked and defined them. If this were a portrait, you'd leave the highlights for last. These lights silkened her black skin. I'd have put in an earring, something simple in good gold for contrast, but she wore no jewelry. I imagined a powerful and sweet odor coming from her as from a still panther, and the head was nothing else but heraldic. I got off the van without saying goodnight. Good night would be full of inexpressible love. They went on in their transport, they left me on earth. Then a few yards ahead, the van stopped. A man shouted my name from the transport window. I walked up towards him, he held out something. A pack of cigarettes had dropped from my pocket. He gave it to me. I turned, hiding my tears. There was nothing they wanted, nothing I could give them but this thing I have called the light of the world. Thank you.
The light of the world, that's my favorite. Thank you for reading that. Thank you so much. I wanted to begin somewhere else, but I'm just really moved by that poem, and I think you're also moved by it. And I want to ask you, what's so moving for you about experiencing that poem again?
I think there's a time, or there's a continual time in which you want to be as clear as possible. You want to reach out directly to the reader or to yourself. And so your vocabulary becomes extremely simplified. Something that someone might say, or you might say, not in an off moment, but in sincere exchange between yourself and the reader. I felt very overwhelmed by a need to describe Castries as I knew it to be, not in any projection of fantasy or contempt, but with the correct balance of judgment that would come. There are many things in there that are extremely touching, just in real life. You see a woman trying to sell some sweets, you know, nobody's passing, nobody's buying them, you know, that stuff. Or you see drunk women at a rum shop at the end of the week, stuff like that. So I was trying to contain that in a kind of a tribute. The light of the world is not necessarily religious. It's the kind of light you see at 4 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon in the tropics, especially slanted on walls and so on, which is a suspended kind of experience, but it's magical. It's Dantesque in a way, that everything at twilight in the tropics balances and trembles on its pivot. So that's kind of what I wanted. Plus, I wanted to get in something of my affection for Marley's thing.
Yeah.
That's mainly it, I think.
Yeah. I think what I've thought about almost obsessively, and Ramabai also referred to it, about the way in which this conversation is intergenerational. And so I've been thinking about the way in which this light of the world that you are describing has not really been described before. And I'm thinking about that essay. There's an essay where you talk about bringing breadfruit into serious literature, you know, and what that moment is like. Because for me, I have no memory of a Union Jack coming down. I have no sense of a world where Caribbean literature did not exist. But this is radically different than your experience. And I mean, you've talked about it before, but I just wanted to get a sense of what that moment was like.
There's another moment I'd like to describe, which is funny. How in St. Lucia, World War II was declared. It was declared by a guy on a bicycle. I think he was a policeman, not either a policeman or a volunteer. I don't remember him in a uniform, but he did ride a bike to every corner, and then he blew a voluntary. And people saying, Saki, what happened, what happened, what happened? Laje. War. That's the declaration of war in St. Lucia. People asking, what happened, what happened? War. Those are what Joyce calls epiphanies, moments in life that the artist is struck by, which sometimes magnify themselves into epiphanies, religious experiences, by some concentration that happens outside the artist, but is there in the minimal, very small experience. Like, that's an epiphany, the guy blowing a trumpet like that, a bugle, not a trumpet, and pedaling, getting off the bike to blow it, and mounting the bike and going on, and telling some island in St. Lucia, thousands of miles away from Whitehall, that war has been declared, and the consternation that happens, or what is it that happens to people when they hear there's a war, in the Second World War.
There's something about the strangeness, and I don't mean strangeness in a dismissive colonial way, but there's something about that story that is so Caribbean, and just resonates with the strangeness of the place. And I mean more that there is nowhere else like it. But St. Lucia specifically, what was it like for you growing up there?
In St. Lucia?
Yeah.
I think I was very happy. I had a great mother. My brother was wonderful, and so forth. But I knew very early that I wanted to be a writer. I mean, I knew it because my father used to write and my mother was a teacher. So from very, very early, I knew that I wanted to be a poet. And so I devoted myself to doing that very, very early. And since I knew what I wanted to be, I knew in what direction I wanted to go, which was to imitate from the best masters, and that included drawing and painting. But the good thing about it was that I knew that that is what I wanted to do with my life very early. And I was surrounded by people who helped me. I had two great teachers, two young men helping me. I had a Bajan headmaster who made me recite a poem to the whole school, Just people accepted, Derry wants to write. Right. This is remarkable. I think it's a benediction for me.
But that must have required a tremendous amount of faith.
Faith in?
Well, I don't mean it in a religious sense, but...
Well, I felt very dedicated to continuing my father's work.
Yeah.
My father died very early, absurdly early. He died at 31 of an ear infection, which is ridiculous also. But I knew that he wrote some pretty good comic satirical verse, and he was a very fine painter, watercolors as well. So I just knew as if, this is what I'm inheriting. Right. This is what I shall continue to do. And my mother was completely understanding because she had a husband who was an artist and who wrote sketches for a group of people. So this idea of a group of people in St. Lucia, one including, I've written about this already, so you know, a violinist, a singer, an actress. My mother used to do, mercilessly, she used to do Portia's speech. I mean, so we used to, in chorus, tell her, "Mama, please keep quiet." But she loved to recite.
Yeah.
Very, very theatrical. So I had that around me, you know, which made my direction simple.
Yeah. And also, I hear faith, tremendous faith on the part of your mother as well, who they call Teacher Alex.
Yeah.
But what Ramabai talked about, the very first book that you self-published that came out when you were 18. And so your mother gave you, how much was that, $200 to publish that book?
At that time, a fortune.
What's the weight of that? I mean, emotionally for you, that $200?
No, I remember going up to her. She used to sew, and she was by the window, and I said, "Mama, I need $200 to do a book." So I saw the I saw the shake and then the shrug. Okay, so she gave me the money to print it, and I sold it on the streets, you know, for I think $1. I never paid her back. I felt she owed it to me, or to her husband anyway. But she was greatly encouraging, to my brother too.
Yeah. But I want to sort of remain in St. Lucia because I went to St. Lucia for the first time to interview you in 2003. St. Lucia has 2 Nobel laureates. What? And of course, the other Nobel laureate is Sir Arthur Lewis, who won for economics. What do they put in the bouillon in St. Lucia?
I wrote a play about a guy called Jordan, who was a Bajan. The debt that a lot of Caribbean writers owe to those teachers, male or female, should be recorded. It's phenomenal, you know, because of the discipline and example of these people who look comic to other people, but who are dedicated to the purity of certain ideas, like speaking well, you know, or writing well. I mean, we had a lot of those. I mean, mainly they were Barbadian or Guyanese, principally Barbadian.
And didn't you have Irish teachers as well? Did you?
That's much later. No.
Okay.
The brothers.
The brothers.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So this, as you say in the Schooner Flight, the sound colonial education is really fundamental.
Well, I think the education of a lot of people in the Caribbean, maybe the Commonwealth. You see, the people who, it's not a Caliban situation, but it almost is.
Okay.
It's not like, you know, in Caliban and the Tempest, the cannibal says, "You taught me language, and my profit on it is I know how to curse." It's beautiful.
Yes.
But the really beautiful thing, and I've said this before, is that the language of Caliban is the best language in the Tempest. Better than all the white people talking, whatever you want. Because he says things like, "Be not afraid, the isle is full of noises." You know, it's beautiful, that whole section. So that not only the poet Caliban made from Prospero, I don't think it is Prospero who makes Caliban talk beautifully. I think Caliban is instinctually a tribal poet. That's what he has in him. So Prospero can't make him a poet. He may teach him another language, but I think Shakespeare proves that by making Caliban talk so beautifully. Anyway, whether it was going to be in English or in his own tribal language, it would be poetry, right? and it wouldn't be translated, it would be instinctual.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of misunderstanding by a lot of people in presenting the simplicity of Caliban Savage, Prospero, Professor,
Right.
if you want.
Right. Yeah. Well, I want to connect that to your sense or your relationship to tradition. I mean, you already talked about your coming of age as an artist as being about imitating the masters. And I've heard you say that originality is rooted in origin as a way of sort of communicating this. But I wonder, what is the next step? I mean, that's part of what I hear you saying about Caliban, is that he learned Prospero's language, but there's something else beyond that he does, or that Prospero can't do. So what's the next step after imitation of the masters?
Well, you see, it's not really imitation.
Okay.
Let me do another kind of parallel situation.
Okay.
All of us still are growing up in beautiful landscape and seascape. It's just beautiful. And that's what you are born to and you grow up in. The presence of that landscape or seascape inside you is superior to whatever language you speak. It is stronger than the language that you speak. A mountain, a bay, a beach, a tree is stronger than anything you write as a physical, beautiful thing. So that admiration is instinctual, whether you can write English or not. A savage would have it, and so on. What authenticates and gives it language is this. You have the power of the beauty of the language around you, of the landscape around you. That's there. You can't pull it down, you can't criticize it, and there's no aesthetics particularly attached to it. Because you have that, and because you're learning or practicing as a craft, practicing a language within that landscape, inside that landscape, it's bound to come out new and different and interesting, minimally interesting.
I see.
So that the young writer in the Caribbean can't help but be interesting because he or she comes out of that landscape or seascape that makes him want or them want to write. And that is superior to the actual achievement in a sense. In other words, you can write a book, you've written a book, I have written a book. So we finish the book and we look outside and it's still there.
Yeah.
It's still hard to do. Know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that, to relate the two things, I think, for instance, you can't have a good West Indian writer who doesn't like the sea or swim.
Interesting. Okay. Okay.
Something's wrong with a guy. Oh. You don't swim? Okay. No, I mean that more than just comically.
Certainly, yeah.
Because the refueling that happens to you daily in the Caribbean is to come outside your door, look outside, and you see this astonishing thing that's going on, which is the light on the sea changing.
Yeah.
It's just bewildering.
Yeah. So is this almost interior relationship to landscape, is what I hear you saying as central to the process of finding your own melody? Finding, as they say, finding your own voice?
You know, two West Indian writers talking, a very dangerous thing. Because you can get into all kinds of smarmy, you know, nostalgia, any kind of thing going on. You know. But I'm telling you, though, that you can't separate the rhythm of Mali from the hills of Jamaica. They relate, they are powerfully related, you know. And you don't need the Mali because the hills are there, really.
Yeah.
But ultimately, they are only manifestations of praise. So a lot of the base of Caribbean writing comes from a thing inherited from a tribal inheritance that comes from religion.
So last year I had a student in my contemporary poetry class write to me and say, "Is poetry dead? I'm here to find out." So it's kind of an ironic place to go, but I feel like we need to talk about it. All of the eulogies for poetry or people trying to kill it off. I mean, what do you think about that as a poet? The kind of this idea about the death of poetry.
Well, another piece of ingratitude is that poetry has moved into institutions, the university, for instance. And I don't know how good or safe that is, because I teach creative writing, and the word is terrible, creative writing. That means that everything else is not creative, right? But I think it's okay. I think that the equivalent of, the Renaissance, where you had dukes and princes sponsoring poets and so forth, was inferior to the idea of the institution of a university, in which the university protects the life of the writer by offering us salaries to write and to teach, without interference and without persecution. And I think if I'm asked that I like to teach, yes, very much so. I like to see young people, struggling with poetry. It is a benediction. Any country that encourages poetry as part of its culture, as part of its being, is a good country. And this happens here, not because of papers and stuff like that. It's like it's a paternal thing. You look at, or avuncular if you want, you look at a young writer, and the innocence of that and the craziness of a young writer deciding they're going to be writers, when you have your experience of what it means for them to do it anyway, is a great and moving experience. And I've been privileged to be able to teach people, some of whom have gone on to be published, etc., not mainly through me. People have talent anyway. Anybody tells you that this person made that talent is not talking the total truth. But that, you see, you have to say, I'm in public here in front of a lot of people, and you're talking about something that's very dear and, moving. I think poetry is very connected to religion, to morality, and so forth. And I think that poets are by nature heroic, not because they want to be heroic, but because they have no choice eventually when they are needed. That a poet like Mandelstam, who wrote some great poetry in which he made some terrible remarks about Stalin having 2 cockroaches for a mustache, enough to get him to Siberia or to wherever he went. Under persecution, we have had too many stories, or so many stories, of persecuted poets, people in prison, people in concentration camps, people who have that utterance that must come through them. They have to say, they can't be stopped from saying what they feel in terms of their pain or in terms of their not conspicuous sacrifices. I'm just saying that they're by nature brave. And we've had that courage that comes with the craft. That you may be there in the crowd for Stalin or for somebody, and you're saying to yourself, everybody's shouting yes, but I don't trust this guy. I'm not going to join the waving. I'm going to write something about how I really feel about the waving. The next thing, you're up against a wall with the guys firing at you. So that is the heroes that are made out of people who suffer and write in concentration camps or under duress anywhere. It's just the human spirit that is unquenchable
Right.
in its extreme, you know.
But do you think poetry is in trouble? Because some people may say, on the other hand, yes, there are poets who have been political prisoners, but other people would say there's no use for poetry. No one buys poetry books anyway.
Well, Auden said a great thing once, poetry makes nothing happen.
happen.
Everybody knows that quotation,
Yeah.
which is not true.
Hmm.
Poetry makes a lot of things happen, like if you write hymns, or if you write marching songs, or if you write national, you know, I mean, they're useful, that's practical. As to making things happen, it does make things happen. But the reality is, it's not to be counted in numbers. If there is one person staggering up out of his concentration camp pallet one morning and pulling out some toilet paper or something he can find to write on,
Yeah.
and he will write what he has to write. Poetry doesn't perish.
Yeah.
In fact, it survives. Sometimes poetry survives under persecution, which is the irony of its permanence.
Right.
No, nothing. There's no threat to poetry.
You talk a lot about the relationship between music and poetry as well. And you made a fascinating comment, I don't know if it was a year ago, about rap music.
Yeah.
I was a little surprised to hear it, but you were encouraged by the work coming out of rap. Could you talk more about that?
No. Could be very dangerous.
Well, you know.
The instinct of the best rap poets, I think, is the instinct of every poet, which is to articulate feeling. The trouble with it is that it tries to reach everybody, and it's not really individual.
Yeah.
So its goal immediately is to make everybody sing the same song, right? Which is not the intention of a poet, really. And a poet is really not quite indifferent to, but doesn't really care about the scale of his audience. That's important. The scale of an audience for a poet is the scale between, the distance between me and you. That's the scale. And not, I mean, you couldn't tell a rap poet, okay, you have one audience, one guy in the audience tonight, so go ahead and do your show.
I see.
But you can tell a poet, you know, he wouldn't care once he's got into doing things if his poem is reaching you, because that's what he's aiming at, right? So scale is a matter of, also, the bigger the success, the wider the idiocy.
What about meter and with rappers and rhyme?
When it first came out, it wasn't rap then. When it first came out, it wasn't called rap. It was something else. I mean, rap came later. But what happened was that everybody was becoming black, right? All the musicians were becoming black, getting the money off the trade. And I thought, okay, there's been all this protest, some of it physical. Where is the black American talent going to go next? So it had headed into chaos, into contradiction and chaos. That was a mood of black protest. And you know what happened? The protest came in iambic pentameter and in formal couplets. So I thought, Jesus, these guys you can't stop them because they're too cunning, they're too smart. So you expect a Negro, excuse me, a nigger. It's okay, I said it. I write it, and we talk about that too. to behave in a certain way, right? Chaotic, angry. In fact, the anger was the main thing that was motivating the activity of a black poet or black performer.
Hmm.
But what happened was that it went in the opposite direction. The informality and chaos, or the anarchy even, turned around and hugged form, which is pretty smart. So it turned the revolution around by making the revolution formalistic, cunningly. So you had to have more energy to be black and more cunning to write that kind of music than it was before. Because the one before was just waving your hands and doing what you're doing. But this required writing. That's when it first began. And then, of course, it developed into the monologue that happens in terms of rap and so on. But the phases were not immediate. They were finding, I thought, you know, what is this new weapon? The weapon is heroic couplets. You wouldn't expect it to come from there. You'd expect a continuation of physical protest and anger to multiply as time went by. But the change and the revolution that happened was the young artists said, no, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it very formal, and we're going to write in couplets and continue in one breath, etc. And we're going to have our own scansion, it was brilliant. So that's admirable. And some of it is extremely good still.
I'm wondering what you think about the way in which, in the Caribbean, there's an interesting way in which racial thinking persists, certainly, that this kind of pigmentocracy reigns supreme. But at the same time, Caribbean people will turn around and reject race and respond to its, or reject it as absurd, because it's, in many ways, race is absurd. So there's this kind of contradictory way of approaching race.
The depth of colonialism, if you want, is impossibly profound. Very, very deep wound in colonialism. When I was younger, if I saw a black pilot, a black man in a pilot's uniform, I thought, boy, you know. The whole thing spread to include the fact that there was pigmentation in terms of casting people, that giving a black man to be a cashier in a bank was synonymous with, would you trust a black man with your money? All these things existed among black people themselves. That's how deep the wound of race went. And as for what women suffered because of it, that, you know, a black girl wouldn't get a job in a bank because, you know, somebody with lighter skin would. This is stuff that we inherited and perpetuated, right? Is it forgivable? Yes, because it is the depth of racism, the depth of domination of the intellect that goes with the worst aspect of colonialism, which is aesthetic, not only, you know, this is not good, really. And to confess that to yourself. I mean, the whole question of hair, for instance, you know, good hair and light skin, and can happen in families in the Caribbean.
Certainly, certainly.
My sister darker than me. Sad, but forgivable, easily forgivable.
So then how do we heal from that, or how do we
No, I think
deal
West Indian writers are very reckless in their honesty. They will write that.
Reckless honesty.
You know.
So that's one of the...
Yes, that helps.
Yeah.
You know, if you write a book and write a poem or something, and that people react to what it says, then yes, poetry is making something happen.
Yeah, yeah. This has been an interesting year for you because, as I understand it, you went to Nigeria. You went to Africa for the first time.
Yeah.
What was that experience like?
Well, going to Lagos, parts of Lagos were like going to market, you know.
Yeah.
it was so immediately recognizable
Yeah.
that I felt I hadn't left home for 365 years or whatever, you know what I mean?
Did actually being physically present in Africa, in Nigeria, change your ideas about Africa and the Caribbean?
No, my fight is I don't like any empire. I don't like an empire that is African, that dominates how I should think. I don't like, you know what I mean? I want the freedom to feel the way I feel about Africa. I may not have any nostalgia for Africa at all, and I'm entitled to reject the nostalgia for Africa. I don't have to be told, this is your heritage, you are a black man. Thing I know already, you know what I mean? Don't people lecturing to me about it, you know? And that has led to a very confused aesthetic, I think, about the African presence. The insistence on an African presence in, in Caribbean art, I think, can be dangerous as well, you know?
Even when that is the strategy to respond to the wound?
Yeah, I think it's there anyway, you
Yeah.
know, that's what I'm saying.
I see.
I don't think it has to be made into a campaign or something like that, you know, or to be told. I mean, I look at you and what do I see? I don't see a black poet. You know what I mean? Yeah, I see it in a way, but I mean, I would hate to think that that's how I read your work.
I see.
You know what I mean? But on the other hand, that's how I should read your work. You understand? There's a difference between my saying, oh, such and such a poet, he's such and such a poet, because of his race. And then you have all sorts of things happen. You have to understand what he's saying. You have to understand his anger and all that sort of stuff. Not your anger, I'm just talking about the anger of a young black man. What happens in America goes on. It's terrible. The racism continues. I mean, 2 years ago, they dragged a guy to the, on a road, you know what I mean?
Yes.
These things go on.
Yeah.
And they must not be hidden. And this whole noise about whether you should say the word nigger is a hypocrisy on the part of the people who commit it, you know, who are suddenly penitential, you know, and oh, how could I have said that? How could you have said it? How do you mean, how could you have said it? You just said it.
I want to shift again, because I've been thinking about your most recent book, White Egrets, and the way in which that book is very much in the elegiac mode. And I'm thinking a lot about the elegy, particularly because of this moment. I mean, individually and collectively, this is an incredible moment of loss for us. I mean, you talked about Cécine, there's so many figures, Barry Chevin, the great Jamaican academic, Rex Nettlefoot, we can go on. So I wonder, how are you feeling about the elegy and a moment that is elegiac?
Well, you love people and they die, and that's one of the things poetry does. I think poetry has a great power of healing through recitation. I've always regretted, for instance, on the night of September 11th, right? That when people had access to speaking, all those stars and all the people talking about the sadness of the whole thing, that it could be, you could make a triumph out of tragedy in poetry. It does that. It makes tragedy triumphant. I mean, you can't read Dante, you can't read Shakespeare, you can't read some of the great elegiac poetry without knowing and saying, this has dominated the experience of death for somebody else. And the poem I wish they had said on September 11th to the whole country of America was Dylan Thomas's "And Death Shall Have No Dominion." If you said that on public radio and said it to all the people who have suffered great disaster, a horrible disaster like that, you're triumphing.
Yeah.
Triumphing. You're coming out of the tragedy and saying, and death shall have no dominion, which is like St. Paul's definition of triumphing over death.
Yeah. For
So
me,
that's the power that exists in poetry.
I'm grateful for the present tense of poetry.
Right.
Because I think, I mean, I'm dealing with loss now. The most painful part of loss is tense. You know, the violence of changing to past tense, that he was, not he is, you know. And
yeah, but some great elegies make it he is, make death the present tense.
Right.
Which it is. Maybe there's only one tense in poetry, which is the present tense, as you're saying.
Yeah. Following that, I'm thinking a lot about this moment of loss, but also very specifically this idea of generational shift, about just simply a specific generation moving on, and a crucial generation, particularly for Caribbean people. And I think I know how I feel for sure, and I know how my generation feels, but I'm wondering how you feel about this idea of shift, generational shift.
Well, I'm very sincerely happy that I have lived to see another generation, or even two generations, of young Caribbean artists. I mean, the number of talented, and that sounds like an old man groaning, but it's not. It's just appreciation of the persistence of the presence of art in spite of all these F- people who run the governments in the Caribbean. And here comes an artist comes out of somewhere again, unquenchable, hard to put down. And because they're survivors, people don't bother to help them, because they say, you know, the Caribbean artist has a survival instinct, man, it's okay, you don't need to do anything, right?
Yeah.
Because the strength is what prevents them from being considered pitiable, right? So the thing for everybody to do is to write very badly and act badly and do everything terribly, so the governments will say, oh, they need help. So if we could have a campaign of bad art, it might work. But if you think of the generation of people now writing, there are a lot of names, some of them friends, you know, it sounds as if I'll just be plugging my friends. But there's more than one generation who have grown up and published very good books, who are not dependent on the preceding generation. In other words, I don't see a continuous presence of lambing, for instance, in a young novelist's work, you know, or the presence of somebody else, and so on, which is okay.
Yeah.
Which is very good, in fact, because somebody should write something about an analysis of the individual identity of the islands of the Caribbean. We have jokes about it, you know, Bajans are X and St. Lucians are X and so on. No, nobody says anything about St. Lucia now. But to describe that, sometimes it is related to the landscape, the fact that Barbados is flat and bright, and how do you relate that to whatever poetry comes out of Barbados or whatever novel comes out of Barbados? But Trinidad is a remarkable example of writers who are excellent writers, who are of different races, even, you know, whether it's C.L.R. James is black and Naipaul is an Indian, and so forth, and you know, and that's within an island, right? You go up the road and you have Jean Rhys. I mean, Caribbean literature is pretty phenomenal for the size that it is.
Yeah, it is. There's something that is also really challenging, I think, for my generation, that sort of coming out of this tremendous legacy that you represent, we're still struggling to be recognized. And it's not only individually, but I mean Caribbean literature as a body that there's still an issue of recognition there, internationally.
Recognition by whom? I think people know, without boasting, and you wouldn't want to be boasting, that what has happened in the Caribbean is fairly phenomenal, because we're not only talking about the English-speaking Caribbean.
Right.
We're talking about the French Caribbean, which has in it Glisson, Chamoiseau, Césaire. I mean, 3 writers from one little rock, and you go to across the street and you have Jean Rhys and whoever else may be in in each island, you have genuinely brilliant writers. That was inevitable because of the history of the war and migration and all that sort of stuff, and the mass migration of Chinese and Africa and India and so on had to be articulated at some point by an Indian, by a Chinese, by an, and so forth. So that the becoming articulate that is happening or has happened, and this articulation need not only be in prose or poetry, it can be very much so in music. In fact, it is very emphatically so in music. So if you make a parallel development between, say, a Marley lyric and somebody else writing a poem in Jamaica or something, there's a connection. And of course, there's a connection throughout everything. I'm very glad, for instance, that we can be judged, talk about reputation, we can be judged to be backward because we don't have an avant-garde. That's great. Death to the avant-garde.
Why death to the avant-garde? And I've heard you talk about that a little bit before.
Because it's conceit, most of it, you know. Big countries like France and so on can afford to fool around and do nonsense. But when you need paper, when physically a piece of paper and a pen and ink are something close to your work, or a brush, you know, these are physical, tactile objects that you need to work. That are not proliferating all over the place in some city. That's what you work. You work close to it, even if it's a computer. You are working close to yourself to work. And that privacy, that isolation that the artist needs to create exists now. In fact, we should be lucky to think that the isolation will still be possible for the West Indian writer, young West Indian writer, that he can cut himself off from no trend, right? He doesn't have, there's no trend that he has to join. There isn't like a school of Naipaul, a school of Laming, a school of Carter, and so forth. You know, so that the individuality is emphatically there in the Caribbean, which makes the complexity rich.
So what does the future look like? I mean, I hear you saying resisting these kind of external...
The future is that there is going to be, this region is already, but it's going to become increasingly phenomenal in terms of its output. Somebody will take into account the presence of Hindi, you know, all the other different dialects that are there. And the West Indian genius is still too small. It is not complex enough. It is not, you don't know anything about Indian epic, right?
No.
You should, I should. You don't know anything about Chinese epic. But that's what you have. That's your heritage. So your heritage is
and it's
immense.
Directly my heritage as well.
It is immense. And it is incomparable because of the variety of what your sources are. So as a West Indian writer, you should simultaneously have in your head Chinese and Japanese, not Japanese, Chinese, and so forth and so forth. Even if it's an instinct and not necessarily in language, you have it, right?
So you're saying we haven't even fully begun to tap into that cultural source? I
think we have just scratched the surface of the possibility of Caribbean literature, Caribbean art. I hate to sound like this. I really hate all that optimism.
We have to say thanks to Derek Walcott. It's not every day. It's not every day we get to sit with someone who is widely acknowledged as the greatest living poet in the English language. Give thanks, Derek. Thank you very much for coming.